CDM 2015 changed from 2007 back in April. I stood here about, I think it's exactly a year ago, and said that I was reading out my own personal obituary from a professional point of view. It hasn't been quite the case. I have actually now reinvented a new role called the CDM-A role. The A stands for advisor, as opposed to CDM-C. So the CDM-C role is now dead, and we will now look at some of the aspects with regard to the change in the regulations concerning domestic clients and the F10 changes. Okay, so we're going to have a little look at the overview of CDM as a system and as a structure. We'll look at who the duty holders are now. We will look at Regulation 7, which is specifically with regard to domestic clients who are now covered under the umbrella of CDM. We will look at the new notification criteria. There has been some slight changes with regard to the F10 notification criteria, which is Regulation 6 now. And we'll look at how it all fits together. And we'll have a little summary. The how it all fits together bit is the board on the side here. Best laid plans of mice and men. When I did this with Ringway Island Roads, I had a massive whiteboard to do it all on, so all my bits that are going to be stuck on there are possibly not going to fit, but we'll see how we go. Okay, right. The basic structure and overview. Let's go back one. My view on CDM, and it has been since the regulations started back in 1994, is that it's a management tool. Okay, it's a project management tool for construction with regard to design and reducing risk in construction, and that is all. Okay. If you use it as a project management tool, it is very, very useful. If you don't use it as it's meant to be used, it doesn't add value. Okay. Okay. As with all jobs, you have a client and he instructs projects to start. Without the client instructing, you don't have a job. Okay. Under the new regulations, there is a new formal instruction for a principal designer role. Okay. Now that role is effectively what the CDM-C used to do. Okay. A lot of people are getting a little confused with regard to, it says designer in there, therefore it must be the designer on the project. It doesn't have to be. It can be another designer involved in the project, but he does the CDM-C role. Okay. Information is provided to the designers. That's always the way it was. The information with regard to health and safety, file information, pre-construction information from the client, that's given to the designers. The designers design, that's their job. That hasn't changed. It's exactly the same as it used to be. They undertake design risk management process exactly the same as it used to be. There aren't a great deal of changes with regard to what a designer does under CDM 2015. The HSE is notified under the F10. It was always notified before, but the criteria has changed slightly, and we'll look at that in more detail with regard to that regulation. Pre-construction information is produced by the design team and is issued to other parties involved, such as the principal contractor or the contractors involved in the project. There's a construction phase plan which is produced. The construction phase plan is developed during the construction phase, and there's a health and safety file is compiled, completed and handed back to the client. For most of you, you're going to say, well, that looks exactly the same as CDM 2007. It pretty much is. There isn't a huge amount of change between the old regs 2007 and the new regs 2015. If you understood how the process worked under the 2007 regs, you will understand how the process works under 2015. There isn't going to be a huge amount of shock to you with regard to your own understanding. There's just a few slight changes of duty holder position and a few criteria changes, and that is all. Okay. The duty holders. Again, it's going to look exactly the same as it used to, apart from the odd one or two. The client, always been the client. Principal designer. So this is one of the new duty holder positions, and the regulations say it is actually a new duty holder position as opposed to a hybrid of the old duty holder position, which was the CDM-C. The principal designer, as I said earlier, it doesn't have to be the designer. It may well be the designer for the project, but it doesn't have to be. But the regulations state it should be a designer. So what they're trying to do, and I agree with the principle, even though it's reduced my workload, is put at the feet of the actual producer of the risk the responsibility to reduce and manage the risk. Okay, and for me that makes perfect sense. Designers and sub-designers are all exactly the same. Designers, if there are any designers in the room, it's business as usual for you. With regard to your understanding of your duties under the regulations, it's pretty much exactly the same as it was before. Principal contractor, we always had a principal contractor role under 2007. Again, for contractors in the room, it's business as usual. It's just you are now coordinating with different people from the pre-construction information situation rather than post-construction and during the construction phase. It's exactly the same as it was under 2007 for you. Contractors and subcontractors, their roles are pretty much exactly the same as it used to be. And when we have a new wording for everybody else which is in construction who aren't already listed above, they're now called workers. Okay? Find that amused. Okay, so that's the list of duty holder positions under the new regulations. And apart from that one there, it's pretty much exactly the same, okay? And if you are confused about what that one does, think of what I used to do, CDM role, okay? It's about the coordination of the information with regard to the design aspects of reducing risk in construction, okay? F10 notification, this is one of the other major changes. It's the client's duty to notify. It always was the client's duty to make sure the F10 was notified, but the CDMC had the role to do it. Now under the new regulations, it's the client's duty, and if you go onto the HSE website and use their form, which is very handy because it covers all the bases that you need to cover, there is a declaration with regard to your understanding as a client that the information is correct. Okay. In real terms, I think this will be done by the principal designer on behalf of the client, because he'll just ask the principal designer to do it as part of his brief for the project. It's got to be done as early as possible, post-initial design stage. That's all exactly the same as it was before, no change there. What will actually happen in real time is it will be done Friday afternoon before work starts on site on the Monday, as it always was. But it should be done, and always was, with regard to being done as early as possible from the initial design. Okay. Notification must contain the particulars relating to the project, so it's the who, when, what, how long, that sort of information. And I would suggest if you are involved in doing F10 notifications, then use the HSE version on their website, because it covers every base that you need to cover. You don't have to use it. There's no regulation that says you must use their form, but it's a very useful pro forma to use. Okay, it must be displayed in the site office. Exactly the same as it used to be, so you must display it so that anybody who wants to see that the project has been notified can see it. Okay, regulation regarding F10, which is regulation 6. The project is notifiable if the construction work is scheduled to A, last longer than 30 days and have more than 20 workers working simultaneously at any point in the project, or exceed 500 person days. There's a couple of little small equations there you can see on the bottom, very easy mathematics to work out. So the bigger change here is the fact that it's the 500 person days aspect is now the driver with regard to predominantly whether it is going to be notifiable or not. The last more than 30 days, but also have 20 workers working simultaneously. You could reduce it down to 19 and then it's not notifiable if you're going to work within that period. So generally it's going to become down to the 500 person days is going to be the criteria that you need to look at. So there will be a whole raft of projects which previously under the 2007 regulations would have been notifiable because they would have lasted more than 30 days on site. Now those are no longer going to be notifiable because they wouldn't hit the 500 person days criteria. Okay, so that's the new milestone for when, the trigger point for when you have to notify. Okay.
I'll just check. So that's obviously in the plan. As we know, things on site can exceed exceed time, etc. Or if you get, I don't know, even wet days or what have you. What happens if it's, I don't know, it's planned for 490?
You can only plan for what is foreseeable.
Okay.
That's as simple as that. You have to do what is reasonable under the law anyway, so you can only do what is foreseeable. So at the time of when you notify and when the project is being in its concept stage and then first of all going to be notified to the HSE, you anticipate that it won't be, then you don't need to notify it. If things change, then you, at the point when you know it's going to be notifiable because things have changed, then you need to notify. But you can only do it when you know that it's going to hit that trigger point. Okay. The other small change to the regulation, which I haven't put down here, is that it must be for the period of the construction phase, where under the old regulations there was a kind of an unwritten law that if it was going to go over a couple of weeks you didn't actually have to put in an additional F10. You do now. It must be down to the full construction period. Okay. I did actually miss, I think one slide has jumped back. Let me just go. Did I miss one? One slide hasn't actually come out, which is the whole of the wording for the F10 notification. I don't know why that hasn't come out, but you're having trouble with yours, I'm having trouble with mine as well. I did have it verbatim on what the wording was, but unfortunately that slide, after mucking around with it last night, hasn't come out. Okay, domestic clients. I'm now going to find out that the PowerPoint that I've put up is actually the old one and I should have used the other one. Domestic clients. This is the other major change with regard to 2015 regulations compared to 2007. Domestic clients are now included in CDM, okay? Whereas before, even though professionals, with regard to contractors and designers, you still had duties under CDM because you were professional. There was an understanding that CDM, I think they were slightly misled, didn't apply when they were working on domestic projects. The only person that wasn't included under CDM for domestic projects was the domestic client. There was still a requirement to reduce risk, manage health and safety as it should be on a construction site for the construction professionals, okay, which is basically how CDM works. Now they've included domestic clients, so that goes right the way across the board. So every construction project is covered under CDM, full stop, okay, de facto. There is no construction project that doesn't have CDM applied in some shape or form. Okay, it may not be notifiable anymore, but CDM will apply to those construction projects, okay, regardless of size, shape, complexity, or importance, okay. Regulation 7. Where the client is a domestic client, the duties in the regulation 4.1 and 0.7 and regulation 6 must be carried out by the contractor on the project where there is only one contractor, the principal contractor where there is more than one contractor, the principal designer where there is a written agreement with the principal designer to carry out those duties. So the difference between A and B here is that there is a formal appointment with regard to principal contractor under the new regulations, which means that if there is more than one contractor on site, you must have a principal contractor. If there's only one contractor, he's just the contractor, but in real terms he is the principal contractor because he's the only one on site and he manages himself and his own men, okay? If you have a second contractor on site, then the contractor who is in control of the construction site is the principal contractor.
A slight question on that. If the other contractors are working for one contractor,
yep,
is that still the case, or is it if they've been appointed separately?
Now, if they are part of your business, if they are employed by you, yeah, Crown Park Builders Limited, yeah, and you are the only contractor on site, and those are your employees, yeah, you are one contractor. and you are in charge of them. Okay, I mean, there's no difference with regard to what your duties are, because you still have to manage health and safety, you still have to coordinate with your workers with regard to the construction phase plan. Because the other aspect is that because every project is covered under CDM, every project must have a construction phase plan. There is no trigger point for when a construction phase plan comes into place or doesn't need to be put in place. Every single project under CDM 2015 is covered. So therefore you must have a construction phase plan for every single project. Now that doesn't mean that you have to have a file this thick for every single construction project, because if you're only I don't know, digging up a pathway and putting in a new road gully in, and it's only going to take you 3 days to do, you don't need a file this thick with regard to the complexity of that job to manage the health and safety on that job. But what you will need is to put a small plan in place. It may only be 2 pages long with regard to management of those construction health and safety issues. Okay, it's proportionate to the risk. Okay, but there must be a construction phase plan. Okay.
Similar to the chap's question behind, so just separating A and B out a little bit. So if there's a domestic client, and I work with the council and we deal with sort of grant projects and things. So let's say, for example, domestic client, they need a bathroom adaptation, but totally separate to that, they also need an external stair lift or ramp, something like that going on.
They
contractors, they're employed, they're not.
Yeah, but if it's a housing association,
no.
This is
owner occupier, let's say.
Owner occupier.
Yeah.
So it's their own property.
Yep.
For work on their own property, being instructed, so they're not a tenant, which is being done under any other. Yep. So if they are a true domestic client, so it is not the furtherance of anybody's business, whether it is a housing association or a landlord who owns the building, it is their property and it's their instruction for the work to be done. They are a domestic client. Yep. Yeah. The duties are applied to domestic projects, but the domestic client discharges those duties, as we'll see in a minute, if the slide comes up, onto the designer during his instruction, and the contractor during the construction phase.
Right.
Okay, so the duties are actually held and discharged by during the work, when the work's been done, by the contractor.
Okay.
Okay, unless there is a written agreement with the designer, the principal designer role could be done by a designer if there's a written agreement between them.
Okay. If these two individual projects, let's say one project was the bathroom, one project was this external.
Yep.
If they're carried out
simultaneously, yeah,
then one of those are likely to have to take on the role of principal contractor.
This is the little grey area. It's the 3 men in the bathroom question that was raised when the regulations first came out. What happens if you've got a plumber, electrician and a tiler, and they're all working different times, and then you've got somebody outside doing their driveway at the same time? Who is going to be the principal contractor? I would look at it like this. The guy doing the driveway outside, if he's his own contractor and doing that work in isolation and is not going to be, there's no cross-pollination between him and the tiler upstairs, then he is the contractor for his work. If that is notifiable, it is notifiable in that right, and he is in control of that. Okay, he would have a duty anyway under the regulations to coordinate and cooperate and communicate with other contractors that his work affects. Okay, if there's no clear line between who can be the principal contractor. Okay, and then the same for the guy upstairs doing the ensuite bathroom. Okay, if he is the guy, the general builder, and he's building the ensuite, and he's then pulling in an electrician and a plumber, he's the principal contractor. Okay, but it is only so that there is a point of communication with regard to management of the health and safety risks, so they don't work in isolation. Okay. That's the main thing. So somebody actually takes the responsibility for managing the health and safety on site. And in my view, it's better. I know a lot of people have asked me, well, I don't really want to take that responsibility on. I'd rather step back and let somebody else do it. But you would be better off, and Charles may well support this view, having a plan with regard to who's going to manage it, and having evidence that you've actually discussed with each other how the situation is going to be dealt with regard to managing risk on site. And then somebody who may be reluctant to have that position undertaking the coordination role than not having anybody at all. Yeah, even if it's the wrong person, it's better to have someone to do it, so there is communication, because it's better to do something than nothing. Yeah. Okay.
Otherwise, you get a position where
Yeah,
everyone else thinks someone else is doing it.
Yeah, I don't kind of understand why people. Because I've got to see. I mean, that's on the sort of the contractor level, and I can sympathise with the contractors and say, well, I don't want all this responsibility. Yeah, but we've also got it with designers. I'm getting large design companies, that employ 20, 30 designers, deal with multi-million-pound projects, are saying we don't want to be principal designer on a project that they are principally designing in complete. They have their own M&E department. They've got structural engineers that they use on a regular basis for the whole project, and they're saying no, we don't want to take the responsibility. And personally, I don't get it, but that's a whole new other discussion. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's good.
Okay, so getting back to this part of the regulation with regard to domestic clients. So if there is more than one contractor, there must be a principal contractor. Okay, and here's the person who is in control of the main construction work on the site, the person that is in the position to manage the health and safety aspects on that site, okay, whether they are large or small, okay. On domestic projects, if there is going to be a principal designer, there has to be a written agreement. It's a formal instruction from the client to the principal designer with regard to his duties under the regulations, okay. He must be instructed in writing, okay. If a domestic client fails to make the appointment, so if the domestic client has not been advised correctly by either the contractor on the project or the designer who's designed his extension, and they've ignored the regulations and decided that they're not going to speak about what their additional duties should be, then Regulation 5 doesn't apply. Now, Regulation 5, I'm not going to put the whole thing, it's quite wordy, but Regulation 5 is for commercial clients. So if commercial clients fail to instruct formally principal designer and principal contractor, they take the duties on. Okay, because it's for the furtherance of their business, they should be in a position where they understand the implications of the regulations with regard to the construction work they're having done. Regulation 5 puts all that responsibility and liability back onto the client if they haven't formally instructed. Domestic clients, because they are lay clients, they don't understand the construction industry, Regulation 5 doesn't apply to them, okay? It then falls back onto the contractor and the designer that are involved in the project. So whether you tell your domestic client or not that you should be principal contractor or principal designer, depending on which role you hold, you will undertake that function anyway under the law, whether you know it, whether you like it or not. And if something went wrong on site, that's what the judge will be telling you, that it's your duty, one, to advise the client anyway, and if you don't, you undertake that responsibility in that duty holder position regardless. Okay? Okay, so the design and control of the construction, or the pre-construction phase, will be the principal designer. And the principal contractor in control of the construction phase is the principal contractor. So that's de facto, that you are that, okay, whether you like it or not, or whether you know it or not. So, and that's just saying Regulation 5 does not apply. Okay, so even if you are not formally instructed to take the client's duties, you take them on and your own, so everything which is under the regulations with regard to being a contractor or a designer, you undertake those duties as well as the domestic clients, okay? In summary, kind of the trigger point is more than one contractor, okay? So if there is a subcontractor, regardless of their size, regardless of the complexity of their work or how long they're going to be on site, for the period of the two contractors on site, there will be a principal contractor, okay? And you are better to do something than nothing, in my view. You're better to have a plan for how it's going to be managed than just try and ignore it, because it is always better to think about what you're doing, how the two are going to work, all three are going to work together, and work out a cognitive plan with regard to managing health and safety on site, okay? It's good practice anyway. The construction phase plan is developed for every project. I don't know why these haven't come down one at a time. It makes it harder for me to read them off the bat. Every project must have a construction phase plan, and it must be proportionate to the risk. Okay, so whether it's one page long because it's only a small job, or whether it's a file this thick because it's a multi-billion-pound PFI project, or whatever it might be in between, it's got to be proportionate to the risk. Okay. And then on every job, the health and safety file must be produced. Okay, health and safety file information. And most people think it's right at the end, but the health and safety file actually starts at the beginning of the job with the client. Okay, the first information relevant to the project becomes the start of the health and safety file. It then should then get populated as the project continues. Generally, what happens, there isn't one at the beginning. At the end, there's a big bum fight over who provides what, and then it all gets chucked in a big file called as built and O&M and handed over to the client, and everybody walks away and it never gets looked at again. That's what happens in reality. Summary. Generally, it is still, as it always was, the acronym which I see is the best way to kind of keep yourself well informed about what you should be doing and proactive about what you should be doing is right information, right person, right time. If you use that as your guidance for CDM 2015, you won't go too far wrong. Nothing has really changed for the professionals, whether you're a contractor or whether you're a designer, nothing has really changed. It is pretty much exactly the same as 2007 with just some nuanced changes with regard to duty holder position, with domestic clients being brought in and the changes to the F10. Okay, and in short, that's it. There isn't. It's not rocket science, CDM. It's very straightforward. It is, as I said before, a project management tool. If you use it correctly, it does add value. Whether it was under the old CDMC doing it, or whether it's going to be under the new principal designer undertaking that coordination role, it does add value if it's done properly. If it's not used properly, it's like anything. It won't add value and it'll be a waste of time and it'll be a paperwork exercise only. How am I doing for time anyway? Oh, bang on. Right, any other questions? We've had a couple of questions. No such thing as a stupid question. So,
is there any standard documentation on the HSE website which you can fill in and therefore produce your construction phase
yes.
plan?
If you are a small builder, there is a very good section on the HSE website which gives you a kind of ready reckoner on various different projects with regard to what you should be looking at. There is also now an app which you can download for domestic projects, which basically asks you what is involved in the project with regard to the risk aspects, and then gives you some very basic and very standard risk assessment and method statement information, and then it's for you then to develop it to make it site specific. That's on the CITB website. You can download the app onto your phone, so you can do it on your iPad and you just put the details in. It actually produces a little document for you. But the HSE have some very good small builder information, what you need to know, I think it's called on it as a small builder, and it's very good information. Yeah. Any other questions? No. So we're all absolutely clear on how CDM 2015 works, yeah? Okay, right. Now I've done this 4 times so far, okay? This flowchart here, which is, I normally start by saying I'm dyslexic, okay? So reading information I find quite difficult, okay? But when I see things visually, it kind of falls into place a lot easier. So for Island Roads, I did a presentation and a workshop where we actually stuck the duty holder positions and how they fit into the equation of the flow of information through concept, pre-construction, mobilisation, construction phase, end of project, health and safety file, and put a flowchart physically together, and I just talked it through. So that I'm going to try and do it again, and I've done it 4 times now, failed miserably all 4 times to be able to get to the end. And this morning the board that I've got, as I said, is a lot smaller than the one that I did at Island Roads, so I'm not sure they're all going to fit on there. But I will have a small go, so that's the end of my presentation. So if you want to get yours ready, Charles, whilst I do this. So bear with me if this fails me. I've got to get it in the right position for the camera. Right, can you see that all right? Okay. Can everybody see the board? You all right? Okay. Right. So, whether you want me to do this or not, I'm determined to get to the end of this. Okay, right. Client. Okay, so we have the client instructions and the client brief. I'll try and stick them as close as I can together. So every project has a client. You must have a client, and you must have the wherefore for wanting his job to be undertaken by contractor, designer. Otherwise, there is nothing to start with. Okay, right. So we've got client information. Okay, so he produces his health and safety file information. Okay. He also instructs at this point. This is concept stage. Okay, so he should instruct if it is going to have more than one contractor on site, which is likely if it's a large project. Okay, he will instruct his principal designer. Okay, so we'll put the principal designer role over there. I'll just chuck it over the top to make sure I get them all the way down. Okay, so he will also instruct. It doesn't have to be a formal instruction, but there's likely to be a contract between the two of them generally. If on bigger projects there will be contracts, so there will be a designer's role. And at some stage, and I'll put it on the side here, okay, he instructs a principal contractor. Okay, the role of the principal contractor might come in later on, but effectively there will be an instruction for a principal contractor. Okay, so let's just look at what the designer does first of all. Okay, so he undertakes his design process. He will undertake design risk management. Let's split the blue tack. And he will, if he is a competent designer, he will produce a residual risk register. Okay. The principal designer, one of his roles is to ensure that there is a coordination. I'm not going to stick that one on there because it's going to cover all the other. But his role is to coordinate between this process, the design information, on behalf of the client to make sure that when he is discussing with his sub-designers and his structural engineers and any other design team that needs to be involved in the project, there is a link between them all. So they're not working in silos, not working in isolation. Okay? One of the first aspects when the design is past its initial stage, which will probably be undertaken by the principal designer, will be the F10 notification. Okay? Principal designer coordinates the flow of information between the design team. Okay? It's pretty straightforward, pretty easy. During this stage, or just at the end of this stage, okay, during the pre-construction stage, there is going to be pre-construction information which is produced, okay? And this is produced from all the information which the designers have put forward with regard to health and safety risk that the contractor is going to need to know for his construction phase plan, okay? Let's say the principal contractor is going to be instructed. So at this stage, we've got principal contractor. They've got their tender information. They're going to be instructed. So then there is a pre-construction information pack, which is issued by the principal designer based on this coordinated approach between all the designers. Okay. Pre-construction information is produced. At this stage roughly, because it's mobilisation period, there will be an additional F10 I like to do the F10 in 2 hits. One is an initial notification to say this is the job, this is likely when it's going to be, these are the duty holders at this point in time that we understand. You won't have a contractor potentially, you might do at that stage if you want early interaction with a contractor, but if you're going out to tender you won't do. So at the very early stage you do an initial one, and then at the point of when you know who the contractor is going to be and possibly a subcontractor team, and when the project is actually going to start and the contractor has confirmed how long his program is, which is obviously always too short for actually doing the project, you would do another notification to the HSE, and then potentially there will be another one when you realise you're going to run over and they've put an extension of time in, and there will be another one to say that it's actually going to run over by a month at the end of the project. Okay, copy of the F10 gets issued to the principal contractor for putting up into his site office. Principal contractor produces his construction phase plan. Okay, and now the construction phase plan doesn't have to cover everything for the project. If it's a very long project, very complex project, it just has to deal with the initial aspects which are going to cover the start on site and the first processes on site. And then from that point on, it should then be developed as the project goes, okay? And this is one of the other roles the principal designer, if he is still involved in the project, because his appointment will only be for as long as he's been appointed by the client. It may end at building reg approval or planning permission, yeah? If the principal designer is still involved in the project during the construction phase, then he has a duty to ensure that on behalf of the client, that the construction phase plan is monitored, managed and controlled as it should be, relevant to the risks on site. Okay, he has no duty with regard to making it for the information that's in there, but he has to make sure the contractor, who should be a competent contractor, is monitoring and managing and controlling the risks on site. Okay. Principal contractor coordinates health and safety on site with all the other subcontract teams. Okay, his duty as principal contractor is to make sure that all the other contractors discharge their duties under the regulations and any other regulation that comes into force, not just CDM but Health and Safety at Work Act, etc., etc. And his duty is to make sure that they understand their duties and that they discharge them. Okay. Then we get to the end of the project. We have then, obviously, if the designers are still involved and there's still a principal designer involved in the project, then there will be as-built information produced. There will be O&M manuals produced. We have, oh, look at that, counted wrong, one short. And then the health and safety file and the O&M manuals are then collated into however many files and documents are proportionate to the project. So it may be one piece of paper for a very small one, it may be 10 files for very complex and very large projects, and then that information at completion of the project is then issued back to the client for him to hold under the law for the period that he owns the property and controls the property. Okay. It is pretty straightforward, it is pretty simple, but if it is managed correctly, the process as a management tool adds value, okay? Especially this bit here. If the principal designer can do what the old decent CDMC did under the old regulations with regard to making sure that there is a design risk management process undertaken and that risk for buildability is reduced, okay? And then risk for the maintenance and the usability are reduced, then it adds value. If this role is just a paperwork exercise and that they're only there in name just to make sure they tick the box for the regulation and they don't actually do anything, then it won't add value. Okay? Is there any aspect of that that anybody has any questions on?
Who takes the role of the principal designer if the principal designer disappears?
The contractor.
Yes, that's
The contractor will take that role. He won't be the principal designer, he is the principal contractor, but he will take the function of ensuring there is a coordinated approach during the construction phase. Now, the situation that generally happens, the construction projects that I've been involved in, especially larger ones, is there is generally a situation where something changes on site during the construction phase. At that point, there should be a reversion back to this flow of information, this coordination with regard to that aspect of the design, because somebody needs to look at the design, look at making sure the risk has been reduced, making sure that it's buildable, okay, maintainable and usable as well for the end user. That whole process goes back again to point A, start again, design information, coordination, flow of information, pre-construction information, construction phase plan, or in that point in time it would probably be a safe system of work, method statement for undertaking that individual process. That goes into the construction phase plan, and then you move on, and then you deal with the next one. Now, if there isn't a designer on board, then somebody, especially if it's something complex, would have to be instructed at that time to undertake that design process. And then they will become principal designer for that aspect, potentially, if it is something complex. And this whole process, this whole flow of information starts again and carries on until you complete the project.
If it's a design build,
if it's design and
contractor have the...
Yeah, well, the design and build, you will potentially have, under that procurement route, you would have, before you go to the stage where you get instructed as the design and build contractor, there will be a principal designer for the pre-construction stage. For the period of his instruction, there will be a principal designer.
The client might have just been appointed the principal contractor.
Yeah, and when you go to design and build, he may not be carrying on with his appointment. So then you, as a design and build contractor, would undertake the function of principal designer and principal contractor, because you're in control of both. You're in control of the design team and your contracting team. Good question, though, Trevor. I knew you'd ask an awkward one. Right. Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
If there was a change in principal contractors, is there an obligation under regulations to forward any information through to the next contractor?
Well, yes. Depends how the change comes about. If it's liquidation of the contractor, the chance of you getting anything is zero, but the client actually holds the duties for making sure that the contractor has the relevant information.
An example is for an external lift, for example.
Yeah.
It's usually the groundworks contractor is different to the specialist equipment fitter. They're both working on the same site but at slightly different times. So if there's anything that's left by the principal contractor originally, the contractor.
Well, anything that's, if they worked in complete isolation, but there was a next phase to go through, there should be a flow of information at the end of that first phase, back to the client. Job complete, health and safety file. That information is health and safety file information for any further work that gets done on that building. If it's the next day, it's still information that is relevant to the next phase of the works on that building. If it's 10 years' time, it is still the health and safety information for the next aspect of work on that building. It's exactly the same. So if they want to put them into little silos, they just have to deal with a whole load of appointments and duty holder positions relevant to that aspect of the work. And this is why the regulations have kind of changed slightly with regard to the formal appointment of the principal designer, with regard to how this situation works, that it's a formal appointment, so that that you can actually put a package together under the law. If you've got more than one contractor, you must have a principal designer, you must have a principal contractor. If you want to package up work, that's fine, and have them working in silos. It's not best practice, I think, to do that. It'd be better to actually have somebody who's in control of everything, so you've got a coordinated and a sort of cognitive approach to the whole project. But if a client wants to do that, he then has a duty to make sure that the next one has all the information for the next bit, and then he has to make all those appointments again. So whether they will or not, time will tell. I mean, personally, I know it's reduced from my point of view, my direct involvement with regard to projects as a CDMC, because before I was actually part of the team and as a duty holder as part of the contracting team or the design team, and how that role worked through. Now that I've got a kind of a subsidiary role as a CDMA, I still think that the new regulations, 2015, actually improves the situation. That's even though it's reduced my workload. So I think it is an improvement into the industry. Whether we'll find that out in 10 years' time and I'll be proved right or not, we'll soon see. I thought 2007 was good, but I think 2015 potentially has can have a better involvement with regard to reducing risk on site. I think the principal designer role can add value if undertaken properly. Right, any more questions? Oh, one more.
Yeah, I've got a question. What role or responsibilities might play into all this when myself and sort of colleagues who work with the local authority, so Justin is a building inspector, I'm just thinking perhaps of a conservation officer, so there's a project going on, I don't know, maybe on a listed building, conservation officer perhaps comes along and has got certain, something was perhaps being planned in a certain way and then
I know your question.
a requirement, don't quite like it done that way, you need to do something.
Local authorities hold no duties under CDM.
Right.
Justin might be able to, and John might be able to clarify, but I believe the regulation states that local authority is not a designer.
Right.
If they are instructing you to do something, it is with regard to you complying with building control regulation. Therefore, they're not designing that, they're telling you you haven't done it right, you must do it a different way. I think conservation officers are exactly the same. The only time they would become a designer under the law, Charles will be able to tell me whether I'm speaking out of turn, please shout me that, is that if they are asking you to do something which is outside guidance from their own regulation. If they are wanting you to do something which is their own personal opinion on how you should do it, rather than guidance from their own regulation, then they would become designer, but then you'd have to prove that that was actually outside that guidance. Is that correct, John? Yeah.
That sounds right.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, they are bulletproof.
Sounds good to me.
Okay. Any more questions? Is that clear? Straightforward? Yeah. Clear as mud? Yep.
Worth turning up just to find that out, Howard.
Okay. That's a wrap.